top story of the day is that a few hours ago, the plane carrying the Wall Street journalist Evan Gershkovich and two other US citizens freed in a prisoner swap with Russia landed at an Air Force base in Maryland. The Wall Street Journal reporter was greeted by his family on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews. Waiting to welcome him with his loved ones was President Biden and also the Republican nominee Kamala Harris, who were both helped to broker the landmark prisoner exchange with the Kremlin. President Biden addressed the media from the airstrip just after greeting Evan.
My job is to make sure, number one, they don't get them. If they do, we get them back. I don't buy this idea that you're going to let these people rot in jail because other people may be captured. We will set out all the notifications to all the other countries, all our citizens, what countries not to go to, what to do, what not to do, and they got to pay attention. I got more work to do.
Well, joining us now is Peter Conradi, the Europe editor of the Sunday Times and the author of Who Lost Russia? From the Collapse of the USSR to Putin's War in Ukraine. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Well, it's all happened very quickly. I mean, difficult to keep up. I mean, what exactly has gone on over the last 24 hours?
I mean, what has gone on is something completely extraordinary. By far the biggest prisoner swap, one should say, because only some of them are spies, prisoner swap since the end of the Cold War. So we've had basically 16 people who the Russians have been holding, who have been released in return for 7 people whom Western countries have been holding. It all happened yesterday in Turkey, and both sides have all now returned to their respective homes.
And who are the people involved on both sides who've been released?
Well, I won't go through all 23 of them. As you mentioned, the one that most interesting is Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested by the Russians in March of last year. There is also an Anglo-Russian, Vladimir Karamurza, who is a historian, a dissident who'd been sentenced to 25 years in jail in Russia for treason. Also, I think mentioned in the report earlier, Paul Whelan, who is a former Marine security executive in America, who's part of those that have been returned to America. Now, the key figure in all of this on the other side is a Russian intelligence officer and hitman called Vadim Krasikov, who shot dead a Chechen dissident in Berlin in 2019. Was jailed for murder, and he was released by the Germans after some considerable prodding, we think, by the Americans. And he appears to have been sort of key to the whole process because it was essentially him that the Russians really wanted back.
Is it too crude to say that basically the people the Russians have got are bad people and the people that have been got out are good people?
I think that's a very, very accurate depiction of what's happened. I mean, it's different because the last swap that we saw was back in 2010, which involved Sergei Skripal, a former Russian intelligence officer who, you remember, the Russians tried to kill with Novichok in Britain. That swap was very much between spies, intelligence operatives, whatever you want to call them, on both sides. This is basically a whole series of Russian hitmen, intelligence officers, and common criminals who have been swapped for Western journalists, Russian human rights activists, and so on. So exactly as you described it.
Give us something on the background to these negotiations. I mean, after all, Russia is facing sanctions. It's engaged in an unjustified war in Ukraine. How have they managed to negotiate this?
I mean, that is extraordinary, isn't it? On the one hand, we're sort of give the impression, Western governments give the impression that they don't want to have anything to do with Russia. We have sanctions against them. No one will talk to Putin. Yet there are these so-called diplomatic back channels. All the discussions have been going on, and they've been going on for a long, long time, as far as we can tell, because I think the Russians have been pressing for a very long time to get hold of Krasikov, their killer, who the Germans have been holding. Was that why the Russians then, in March of last year, actually arrested Evan Gershkovich? Well, possibly it was. And we sort of saw from that point on, I think it was very clear that the Russians would not hold Gershkovich forever, that eventually a deal would be done. And, details are only, I think, now beginning to emerge, but negotiations, I think, clearly started in the latter part of last year. Also, another very key element in it, which we haven't mentioned, is Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident or Russian opposition leader who was killed in a prison colony in February of this year. Now, the initial speculation was that he would be involved in this kind of in this swap, because talk of which began to emerge already late last year. Then he was killed in February. We don't know precisely why he was killed, whether it was on the orders of Putin or whether, guards essentially intended to rough him up and it went wrong. That being said, that then cast a shadow over the whole process. It looked like the deal was off, but then it seems to have got back on again.
Now, it just finally, Donald Trump initially said he was the only person who could negotiate a deal like this. Well, obviously, Biden has managed it. But there is a serious point, isn't there, that this will simply encourage this kind of thing from Russia in future and perhaps from others.
Yes, I mean, there is indeed. I mean, what kind of signal does it send to any Western journalist, for example, who wants or is planning to go to Russia? I mean, I certainly wouldn't go there myself because, fear that you could just basically be picked up and used as a pawn for the Russians to swap against one of their hitmen, one of their intelligence operatives who gets picked up in the West. And it's particularly in Germany, one can see the beginning of a bit of a backlash to this, because the Germans were very reluctant to release Krasikov because he shot in cold blood a Chechen in a park in the middle of Berlin. And that there is a lot of concern, particularly in Germany, being voiced to the fact that, this is, we are essentially giving Putin license to do what he wants, because if we arrest any of these people abroad, then he'll just take one of us as a hostage and a deal will be done.
Peter Conradi of the Sunday Times, thank you very much indeed for joining us.